Shut up and sit down.
Hey you, this is Cliff Taylor, and today we're going to poke the bear, and that bear is polling, or polls, or polling objectivity, or polling bias, or polls. All right, so before we get started, make sure you like and subscribe down below, and if you can, of course, share this video because we're new, and we would like to get more people out here. Okay, so polling, yes, polling, that age-old tool that allows even the most foolish of us to seem like we're Nostradamus, that craft or manipulation that allows us to convince people they obviously are in the wrong because the majority of people say so. Two things I want us to look for when we're looking at polls is the margin of error, which we're going to define this way. Margin of error is that statistical expression from the amount of a random sampling error in the result of a survey. The larger the margin of error, the less confidence one should have in a poll. And the margin of error will always be positive whenever a population is incompletely sampled and the outcome measure has a positive variance, which is to say the measure varies. That's the clinical definition for margin of error. We need to understand that margin of error is that plus or minus 5, 10, 20, whatever you see at the bottom of a poll. That's very, very important because that's going to tell you whether or not that poll is very reliable. The lower the margin of error, the more statistical evidence can be applied and the weight of that poll has. It's greater weight the lower the margin of error. Okay, and the other thing we want to look at is a poll, and we'll talk about is a poll scientifically methodized or if it's self-selecting methodized. Scientific methodology, of course, is going to be we are going to poll 25 men, 25 women. Of those 25 men, let's use 100. 100 men, 100 women. And of those 100 men, we're going to use 20% of them will be African American because that's the population that's their percentage of the population. And we're going to use 18% Hispanic because that's the level of their population. And this percentage of Asian, this percentage of white, and it creates a scientific poll. The other thing that and with a scientific poll, you're looking specifically we're looking at these people, these people, these people, so that we can see a consensus of what society is looking at. And then, of course, a self-selected methodology is when an individual gets to decide which group they land in. So if you see a poll online and it has you self-identify, that's a self-selected methodology poll. And, of course, those have the least reliability because anybody can go on and say, I'm a black Democrat, or I'm a Hispanic Republican, or I am a satanic Asian. I mean, it doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want, and the poll will just believe you. So, all right. So, the thing we need to also look at is, of course, the skew of polls. Okay, polls are going to be skewed. They're going to have bias skews, framing skews, and agenda setting skews. So, but those we're not going to get into as much, but we will touch on them a little bit. So, activists. Okay, so who uses polls? Okay, activists use polls. The media use polls. Political parties use polls. Public agencies and private agencies also use polling. These organizations can often use mutant statistics as a tactic to manipulate public opinion. They can often, and they do often, convince people that even the most implausible claims are true by twisting the question's wording in a poll. But if such polls are based on scientific statistical methods, how is it the results can be deceptive, misleading, or even deployed fallaciously to support bad arguments? One of the main problems is that the use of natural language questions in polls containing words and phrases that have emotional connotations and subtly lead respondents toward one answer or another is the way that they create that bias, and they skew that poll and create mutant statistics. Some examples would be if I asked somebody last year, just blindly, what do you think about the U.S. economy, and you would get one answer. But if I phrase that, what do you think about Trump's economy? You can get an entirely different answer. Back in the past, I had a number of students that were doing some polling, and they did just that. They asked a specific question, and then they asked the question by putting the moniker of Obama in front of it. So that became a way that they were able to skew they skewed their poll, and they could see how those differences happened. Some media outlets sponsor scientific polls, but when the results are reported, they often include an online edition of that poll so that they can self-select, use that self-selection method, or that definitely non-scientific method, and they can say, this poll said this, this poll said this, and they can go down the list of the different questions, and they can cherry pick their answers depending on which poll they want to use. And they often do this. And this happens with Fox, it happens with MSNBC, it happens with CNN, it happens with, the American News Network or something. I don't remember what that was. ANN, I think. OAN, I think is what it's called. But I'm not a big fan of that one either. That self-selecting samples are almost inevitably biased and are at best a form of entertainment. And that's what they are. And that's why they use them, because mainstream media isn't all about just getting you the news, especially when 90% of their programming is punditry programming. It's like me. It's somebody who's giving their opinion, stating facts, giving their opinion on the said facts, and going on. They can't be trusted as a source of information about the population as a whole. We really find this to be true when people call, or when polling comes out that, Hillary Clinton was ahead by, double digits and then lost the election. This is attributed to the fact that either people were lying in the polls, they were relying too heavily on these self-reporting polls or self-selected polls, and they were listening to the media say, oh, this is this, and they weren't paying attention to the real numbers. When you look at a poll, you should never look at a poll singly. You should look at a poll in conjunction with other polls that have taken place. You need to look at what we call the aggregate. And if you look at the aggregate on polls, you can see that one poll might say that Biden is up by 18 points. Another poll might say that Biden is up by 5 points. Another poll might say that Biden is up by 1 point. Another poll might say that Biden is down by 3 points. Now, if you take the average of all of those and you put it together, then all of a sudden the math comes out and you say, okay, Biden is ahead by 8 points, or whatever the average is out. I didn't do the math really quick in my head, so if I got the math completely wrong, yay, tell me about it in the comments below. Now, when you're confronted with a new poll that you see, you should ask yourselves these following questions, and I highly recommend you do this. I know I do this with every poll that I read or I hear about. I ask myself these questions. Is the sample scientifically selected or self-selected? That's the first question that you should ask yourself. You should find out, and it tells you on the poll. When you look at the poll, it'll tell you their methodology. If it's self-selected, then take the poll with like a pound of salt. I mean, it's going to be there for entertainment purposes only. And then you want to ask, what is the poll's margin of error? Are there any comparison reports, such as changes in popularity, records of highs or lows, comparisons between the candidates that lie within that margin of error? If so, the margin of error might, or the margin of error might not be statistically significant. And if you find that the comparison between the candidates is way off of that margin of error, then you really might want to start questioning that poll, and then definitely go and look at an aggregate. Never just take one poll. Don't cherry pick polls. That's the problem today. It's people cherry pick polls and say, oh, well, 87% of Americans think that it's bad to kick a dog. Okay, and it doesn't make any sense, and there's nothing significant about that other than a claim that you made. Also, when you look at self-selected polls, you get a lot of emotional attachment and baggage that gets added to that. When you're looking at scientific polls, you have a lot less emotional attachment to them, unless you're looking at framing. You're looking at questions that are framed in such a way to get the answers that they want. And And then you look at, or like I said before, the aggregate. You want to have other polls on this issue been done recently, and if so, it's a good idea to compare the new poll to the other polls, like my example before, Biden up, down. Now, where's he actually at in the aggregate? Focus groups are not polling. We often hear people talk about focus groups. Oh, the focus groups are saying this. Oh, the focus groups are saying this. Oh, the focus groups are saying this. The focus groups is the smallest sample of polling you can possibly get, and it is nowhere near where you need to be when it comes to finding out what the population is about, or population is falling on a specific subject. I think that my biggest concern when people start citing polls, and I cite polls all the time, is that when you are crediting too much to an individual poll because it conforms to your thought pattern, the way you think. Now, that isn't to say that you might have exactly the right answer and most people agree with you, and that's great. There are very hot button topics that when you look at polling, the polls just jump all over the place depending on who's doing the poll, whether it's scientific or whether it's self-selected. It doesn't matter because it has to do with the phrasing of those questions that they ask. If you go back 10 years and we were looking at whether or not people wanted to allow gays to be married, there was a lot of polling that was done, and the polling was all over the place. And it had to do with the methodology of the phraseology that was that phraseology even a freaking word? I don't know. But the way that they framed and phrased the questions drastically increased or decreased the positive results or positive responses by the respondents. Should people be allowed to love who they love? Okay, if you want to ask that question, great. And you're most likely going to get a very, very high, and they did find that they got a very high positive result on that. Should gay men be able to be married and adopt kids? Now you've put two things into one question, and therefore, just like in a true false test, if it's ever false, then you always automatically say false. But in a question like that, you're asking two separate questions, but that's not what the pollsters were asking. They were asking that question specifically to get people to say no. And it's not that I'm against or gay individuals adopting. I'm not saying I'm against that. I'm just saying that was a phraseology that was used at the time. Because I know somebody can just, cut that out and do whatever they want with it. But when we look at polling, we need to look at, if you can, find out what their questions were. Look at their questions. See if their questions are written in such a way to get a emotional response. And if you are called for a poll, don't answer the question in a way to try to grief the poll. Don't be a troll. Don't grief the poll. Hey, that's cool. I should get that on a t-shirt. Don't be a troll. Don't grief the poll. Yeah, that works. Probably wouldn't work. I'd have to find out. But comment below. Tell me if you think it would be a good t-shirt or not. But the ideas of polls and the fallacies of polls is very polling is very subjective. It's not objective in any way, shape, or form, because you have control of the questions that you're asked. You kind of have control of who you're going to ask, and in doing so, you get a lot of people that you're discounting. You're not actually polling. When you look at like Rasmussen polls, it'll say the poll of likely voters, or a poll of registered voters. A poll of registered voters and a poll of likely voters is completely different. They are not the same. They are not equivalent in any way, shape, or form. And then a general poll across the spectrum, meaning you're polling people that can vote, can't vote, and that poll means nothing other than just that becomes more of an entertainment poll, in my opinion. If you're not actually asking people that are registered to vote on who they're going to vote for, or if they like Trump over Biden or Biden over Trump. And that's another thing. If you phrase a question that way, do you prefer Trump over Biden, or do you prefer Biden over Trump? That over builds into your brain when you visualize that is they're above them, they're better than them. So even small phrases like that can skew a poll. On a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think of Donald Trump's economic program? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think of President Trump's economic plan? Asking it that way, just using Donald Trump instead of President Trump, changes things. And those are little, small, minute things that can be used to change and manipulate and create these mutant statistics that get thrown around like they're gospel. If you haven't guessed it by now, opinion polls are bogus, but not much more bogus than most polls. So online polls, opinion polls are completely bogus. If you go back and retake a poll multiple times, you can completely skew the results. But I believe that with polling, you need, when we look at polling, it's a confidence game. How can we tell within the results of a poll that are off by just a little bit of a margin of error if the poll gives a very different result from others taken around the same time or shows a sudden change? We need to question those polls. It's important to pay attention to all of the polls taken at a given topic at a particular time. Otherwise, you have no way of knowing whether a poll you're looking at is widely different from results from a competitive poll. Back in 1936, I believe it was, there was a poll, and they were using a scientific methodology, but it was really skewed. They were polling people that were registered to vote, and if they had a telephone, or if they had a car registration. Now, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. How many people had a telephone in their house? Very few. How many people owned a car? Very few. So the poll was looked at, I can't remember who was running against Roosevelt for re-election, but the poll had Roosevelt way, way down. And that's because the majority of the people that they polled were Republicans. And that wasn't a question that they asked. They just did the poll based off of voter rolls, based off of DMV registrations, and based off of having a telephone in the house. That's how they got their information. They sent out their mailers and they did their thing. And they got a very, very bad result because they did not correct for that aspect of the poll. So I think that's about all we're going to talk about polling today. So you guys be good. You be good to everybody. And we will see you next time. Bye. Hey, really quick, I actually went back and I looked some stuff up, and so here's the information on that poll from 1936. This has to do with, of course, the main error in avoiding an underrepresented sample. So the example that we're going to talk about is the polling fiasco was Literary Digest poll in 1936 presidential election. The magazine surveyed over 2 million people, and you think, wow, 2 million people? They surveyed 2 million people. That's a huge sampling. Most sampling is way, way less than that. So they polled 2 million people chosen from the magazine subscriber list, phone books, so like I said, owning a telephone, and car registrations. Even though the sample was enormous, it was underrepresentative of the population of voters because not everyone could afford a phone or a car during the Depression. And those that could tended to vote Republican in greater numbers than those that couldn't. And as a result of this biased sample, the poll showed Republican Alf Landon just absolutely I think it was like 27 points ahead of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So there you go. And again, see you guys next time.